This is An Economy of One with Gary Rathbun.
This is our country.
We're talking with Peggy Grande. She was, and this is very exciting for me, administrative assistant, is that correct?
Executive assistant, yeah.
Executive assistant with President Reagan for 10 years?
I was, from 1989 to 99, right after he left office.
Right after he left office. Yeah. Okay, that's got to be incredibly exciting to be near that. I mean, his legend has just grown since the time he's left office. It's one of those things that in today's political world, we long for that kind of leadership, that kind of candor, that kind of integrity. What was that like being with him?
Well, how long do you have?
12 minutes.
Exactly. Well, of course, you can imagine it was an incredible experience and such an honor and a privilege to serve that man who, at the time, you knew he was an incredible president, an incredible person, but hindsight and looking back and reflecting on his legacy all these years later, he really has become a giant among greats.
Right.
So it makes that privilege even more special.
You spend a lot of your time now educating people on leadership and presentation, communication skills, and that kind of stuff from things that you've partially learned from President Reagan. What would you say the number one thing you learned that you take away from being with him for that amount of time?
Well, he really exhibited timeless principles, and even though he was known as the great communicator, really his actions spoke louder than his words, and I think it's a great reminder to us to realize that people are watching how we lead, how we live, and it's not just in what we say, but it's also in the life we're leading.
Why do we have such a deficit of that now? I mean, I'm 59. I was a Reagan. That's really where I came into political consciousness, if you will. Prior to that, it was, my first president I voted for was Nixon. I don't tell that to everybody. But why is that so lacking today and so longed for?
I think we are desperate to know what real leadership looks like. And if we reflect on Ronald Reagan's legacy, it's a kind of a surprising formula, and it's really very simple. He was a man who led with humility, with an awareness and appreciation. He always lived with an attitude of gratitude. As a very young person working for him, it could have and should have been a terrifying environment, but he led with such warmth and charm and acceptance that it was not terrifying, it was terrific.
Tell us a little bit about your consulting business, your company, because as I read up on that, I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to try to get some free advice here while I got you. I have no idea what you charge, but I got you for 12 minutes. I'm going to use you if I can. But tell us a little bit about your company and what you do for organizations and individuals. You work with individuals also, I assume?
Absolutely. So it kind of runs the spectrum. Of course, I speak at a lot of political events. The Reagan faithful wants to know, was he really the kind of man that we hoped and thought and wanted him to be? And so certainly there's a lot of political events I speak to. I also do a lot of corporate training, consulting, everything from personal branding. What made Ronald Reagan such a fascinating individual? What were the traits that drew people to him, that made them loyal to him? It wasn't certainly he didn't lead with a firm fist, he led with a magnetism. And so how can we find that in our own life? So I talk about timeless leadership principles of Reagan, everything from high school students all the way to CEOs, in groups and personally. I'd be happy to help you.
I need it. Trust me. We will talk later. But in reading through some of the information I had, you talk essentially about, and forgive me for paraphrasing, a wow factor or how to wow. What do you mean by that?
Well, people were always surprised to see Ronald Reagan, that he was even better than they thought and hoped he was. There's this quote that says, don't ever meet your hero, because if you do, you're usually disappointed. And Ronald Reagan was the exact opposite. So no matter how wonderful you thought he was, you met him, and he was even better than that. And it was everything just from the way he would connect with you with a warmth and twinkle in his eye to being very thoughtful about presenting people with gifts when they came to visit. The follow-up was always there, writing thank you notes, often personally handwritten. It was very important to him that anybody who reached out to him was responded to and acknowledged.
Now, how does that translate to to let's get that free advice. How does that translate to someone like me? I mean, you don't know me from a bottle of Vicks. I understand that. I mean, we just met a few minutes ago. But, I do radio every day. I have a consulting firm of my own that I work with clients all day. What do you look for in working with an individual or a company like myself?
I think the best secret is to tap into your authentic self. Ronald Reagan, we loved him because he was authentically who he was. There weren't two Ronald Reagans, one for the cameras and a different one behind the scenes. So there was a genuineness to him, and I think that draws people to him and to his legacy. So who are you authentically, and how can you be more of that? And there's a tendency to try to be everything to everybody, and really you just need to find your sweet spot of fascination, the best of who you are, and become more of that. And social media is great. I'm on all the platforms, of course, but there really is something to be said still about the personal touch, and Ronald Reagan exhibited that old school really is timeless and best, and that's even today. I can't tell you how many times I'm seated at a dinner between a congressman and a senator, and by the time I get my handwritten notes out the door to them, I have 2 letters from each of them. So that's not antiquated and old school. That's what people at the top of their game are still doing today. So it's a good reminder for everybody from high school up to CEOs.
I was sitting here listening to you talk, and I've read many of the books put out there about President Reagan and different stories. And I read somewhere, and I think he wrote the story, that after he got out of office, President Reagan and his wife Nancy were going to go out to dinner or go to somewhere, and they both went out and got in the car and looked at each other, and they're both sitting in the back seat. And there's no driver up front. and he used that story to say that the trappings of the presidency or anything like that can become easily part of your life that you take for granted.
Right.
And he said him and Nancy just turned to each other and started laughing. and that seems so genuine. I mean, is that the kind of stuff that actually happened? I mean, was that really him?
Absolutely, and they do have Secret Service still drive them, so that story may have morphed a little bit. The story I heard told was that they were driving through town and they were stopped, and the president turned to the Secret Service agent and said, "Why are we stopped? Is there a problem?" And he said, "I'm sorry, sir, the light is red."
That's a better story.
Back to reality.
Yeah. Because I've been in Washington when they go flying through the red lights and everything.
But just very humble and aware. A quick little aside, I was very young and green and inexperienced working for him, and here's this elder statesman, and just the awareness he had. He would reach over and hold my elbow as we would go up and down stairs, which was especially sweet since I was in my 20s and he was in his 80s, and he was always aware and appreciative of those around him.
Well, my wife and I talk about this a lot, and we've seemed to have lost so much civility in life or in society, and I pride myself at trying to be that old school and be that gentleman. I hold doors open when it's raining out. I mean, yesterday coming here, I was very disappointed. An elderly man was ahead of us coming from the parking garage. I'm carrying a whole bunch of stuff. My wife's carrying a whole bunch of stuff. He just walks through the door and keeps going. And he never looked back. Looked back.
Ronald Reagan would have held the door for you.
I would have thought so, But
there was this elegance, this style about him. And even though there was the formality of being the president, there was definitely a familiarity and just a warmth and a charm of never thinking of himself better as anybody else, but just looking at people with acceptance.
Now, I'm sure you get this question a lot, but what is your best story of interacting with President Reagan?
I would have to say it was the way he did diplomacy and watching the heads of state from all around the world come through his office post-presidency. And they didn't have to for protocol or diplomatic reasons. They came because they wanted to, because Reagan's form of diplomacy looked a lot about relationships, not about rhetoric, and it was very personal. It wasn't political. And I just think that's a great lesson for today, and how much more could be accomplished if we focused a little more on relationships and the personal side and not just the politics and the rhetoric.
Well, I was going to ask you, I mean, once again, I don't ask about presidential candidates or anything like that on this show. That's just not my personality. But in your opinion, from your experience, do you see us recapturing that integrity, that diplomacy, that genuineness in national politics, or is that truly a bygone era for a while?
Well, I think it will take on a very different form. And Ronald Reagan in 1976 was not our nominee. And in 1980, a lot of people didn't think that he was the right person for the job. Ronald Reagan always believed that we, the people, should tell the government what to do, not the other way around. So if anything, during this political cycle, I really appreciate the enthusiasm and the increased interest in conservative ideology and the Republican Party. And so that's been exciting to just see a whole new wave of people come to just take a look at the party. And to me, that's exciting. And I don't think our next Reagan revolution will look exactly like the times that it did in the 80s, but I'm hopeful and confident that America's best days still are yet ahead.
It's hard to believe that it's been 30 years.
Right.
You know, I mean, he got in office the year I got married. I mean, my goodness, it's hard to believe it's been that long. But this has been great. We've been speaking with Peggy Grande, and I just really appreciate your time, really appreciate the stories, and it's very nostalgic for me because my wife and I have both very fond memories, and we miss that leadership out there today. So once again, thank you so much for your time. I hope we can chat with you again, and maybe on a professional level, because I need some help. So,
I look forward to it.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
This is our country.